Hey there everyone, today we're going to be looking at Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow to give you a little bit of taste for this quintessential American postmodernist novel. It has quite the reputation, similar to James Joyce's Ulysses, for being experimental, challenging in its breadth of topics, very elusive, and just generally confusing. But I think it actually is quite interesting to look at it in relation to Ulysses and just look at what Pynchon is trying to do to embody the contemporary aspect of anxiety and paranoia which frames the contemporary world. Gravity's Rainbow is about a lot of things. It's about sex. It's about death. It's about technology. It's about history and grand narratives. All of these things are creating a vignette for the contemporary period of what it's like to live in the war and post-war period, that being World War II and post-World War II. And one of the principal plot devices or plot points that's going on here is, as you can see by the cover, it's concerned with rockets, which significantly is a phallic object. It has phallic significance. Specifically, it's about the development of the V-2 rocket by the Nazis. This was a last-ditch war effort to try to bombard the Allies, and particularly London, with heavy firepower that would hopefully turn the tides of the war. And Gravity's Rainbow takes place between 1944 and 1945, so the very end of World War II. And the V-2 rocket was the first guided ballistic missile, and also the first guided ballistic missile to house a nuclear warhead. Now, most of the time, it wasn't using nuclear technology. It just had explosives inside of it. But notably, its destructive power was not as significant as was its threatening power. Its ability to induce a feeling of anxiety and uncertainty that would sort of coat the landscape. And this is something that Pynchon goes to great lengths to explicate in his prose here, is the way this changes the landscape, changes the way we think about sex, about careers, about life in general. And, for example, the British authorities thought that the V-2 was going to house about 7 tons of explosive payload. Actually, it only housed about 1 ton, which is still a lot. But it showcased that, in part, this was a changing way to look at military tactics, in which we shift away from sheer brute force to the idea of fear, of psychological warfare, right? This is sort of military strategy is changing here. It's going to change with things like guerrilla warfare in the Chinese Civil War, which led to the People's Republic of China. This influenced like South American decolonial independence movements. So lots of stuff going on here that's being prefaced by Pynchon. And one of the important things that Pynchon is going to be talking about, as I said, is a feeling of paranoia and anxiety. The opening lines are very iconic. A screaming comes across the sky. It has happened before, but there is nothing to compare it to now. It is too late. The evacuation still proceeds, but it's all theater. Right? So there's this sense of cosmic significance of these rockets going across the sky, sort of framing modern existence. And the idea of it being too late is an important sentiment that Pynchon is trying to deliver. This is the mindset of people at that time, and partly a reflection of the reality of how power works in the contemporary period, in the post-war period especially. It's not like you individually And I mean, it's not like you really ever could. But there was this idea in philosophers of history like Giambattista Vico or Hegel or Marx, that there was a grand historical narrative in which the individual could take part in. And of course, it wasn't like each individual on his or her own would actually be changing this history, but nevertheless, there was at least an inkling of hope that there was some sort of imminent future of utopia coming through, that through opening of one's conscience, through being aware of one's role in the world, you could actually bring some sort of change out. But Pynchon is going to repeatedly show that it is really too late for any of that decisive action. It's as if our action is always belated, and the cogs of history have already started moving, and it's not really our place anymore. In fact, history becomes theatrical, which is important because, cinema is becoming very popular at this time. But it does hint to that fact of, for example, the fear tactics of the V2, that it was more about being theatrical than it was about being purely deadly in the classic sense. And we get this sense of recurrent paranoia, which is going to develop more and more. The plot goes from being relatively clear to less and less clear as we get on. But we've got a typical paranoiac sentiment when Pynchon writes, "There is no way out. Lie in wait, lie still and be quiet. Screaming holds across the sky. When it comes, will it come in darkness, or will it bring its own light? Will the light come before or after?" And this is an important part of the V2 rocket specifically. There was a predecessor, the V1, which made this buzzing sound. They were nicknamed buzz bombs, and you can hear them here. And these made a very distinctive sound, and you would either hear the sound stop for a moment, in which case you had about 10 seconds before an explosion was imminent, or you would continue to hear it buzzing and then you'd hear an explosion somewhere else and you were good. So there was a little bit of an auditory connection to the impending destruction that was upon one. But with the V2, it traveled faster than sound. So you didn't actually hear it unless it hit someone else. So hearing the destruction in a morbid way almost signaled to someone that they were safe. But to have that sound removed, that was actually a sure sign of death. Because you wouldn't actually hear it before you had died from the rocket, and then the explosion would come after. So there's this relationship with sound in which being able to predict death is almost like it won't happen, and to be able to not be able to predict death is to say that it is imminent, and that it's something you can never really escape, and brings along with it this paranoiac mentality. The city itself takes on phallic significance, and of course this links one of the main plot points concerning the V2 rocket and our main character, Tyrone Slothrop. And Pynchon is going to constantly give you weird names like that. I think that's one of the cool quirks of Pynchon. But Slothrop has figured out gradually throughout the work that everywhere he has a sexual encounter, within a few days, a V2 rocket strikes there. So there's this mysterious connection between Slothrop's erections and the destructive power of the V2 rocket. And this is one of the most important qualities of the postmodern style, is the bridging of the high and the low. If you read someone like Hegel's philosophy of history, for example, there is a progression through history from the low to the high. There is a dialectical development as rationality sort of takes us through the ages, and we go from the low peoples to the high peoples. And there's a continuum that separates these, temporally. But in Pynchon, by linking the high and low, for example, of sex and death, bringing those together, we don't necessarily have a delineated differentiation between some high aspect of history and its lows, its failures, like, the destructive power of the V2. And not only that, but we also have the merging of the high and low of the rational capacity of humans to create technology and the low of that technology's destructive capabilities against ourselves. That it sort of heightens this state of total war. And that's one of the qualities that rings the most true throughout Pynchon in terms of understanding the symbolic significance of what he's talking about. Is everything is sort of emulsified into this fluid, ugly mass of destruction that isn't rational. In fact, it's quite absurd. And the city and environment itself gets sort of glazed over with this feeling. And we see at times that the city even takes on phallic significance. He speaks of the city with its gnarled emissions of steam and smoke. Right? So emissions, like the emissions of a penis, which is very interesting to think about. But one of the things that identifies Pynchon's novel is it is in part stream of consciousness, like Ulysses. Thoughts are coming into a character's head as they come in. There are no traditional markers for when we are inside a thought or when we are perceiving something in the world and we're just, thinking about that outside thing. It's not really going to guide us because when we think, we aren't really guided by our thoughts. We sort of fly through them and we have to process them. So, for example, there's this rumination on the destructive capabilities of these rockets. He won't hear the thing come in. It travels faster than the speed of sound, this being the V2. The first news you get of it is the blast. Then, if you're still around, you hear the sound of it coming in. What if it should hit exactly? No. For a split second, you'd have to feel the very point with the terrible mass above strike the top of the skull. So, right, there's a technological accuracy, which, they weren't really that accurate to be able to, target someone's skull. But, of course, this is the paranoiac taking over of, what if it hit exactly on top of me? What would that feel like for the moment where I haven't actually heard it, but I feel the pain, and then I'm dead? In actuality, you wouldn't feel the pain. You would die so quickly before your nerves could actually transmit that information to you. And there's a sense of hopelessness here. It's only a reprieve, isn't it? There will indeed be others, each just as likely to land on top of him. No one, either side of the front, knows exactly how many more. Will we have to stop watching the sky? And that's interesting because you have the traditional kind of medieval/romantic depiction of, looking up at the sky and gazing off at the possibilities of our future. But now looking at the sky is to be looking at one's imminent death. It's to be on the lookout for death. We're not looking out for the possibility of creative action anymore, but as Pynchon takes great strides to show us, we're just trying to break even. We're trying to not reach absolute zero. One of the literary devices that defines postmodern literature in general, and we can see it reified in Pynchon's style, is pastiche. This is an emulation of some other writing style. But in contrast to parody, it's not about making fun of the writing style, as you might get in Joyce, for example, where if you read the Cyclops episode, which I've done a lecture on, he will interrupt the plot with 33 different interpolations of other writing styles, which serve to satirize the content in the plot by putting it in a different writing style. for example, the crimes of the British is put in the style of the Apostles' Creed, one of my favorite Joycean moments. And there, the content being put into a certain form acts to alter the way we're supposed to look at the content and parodies it, makes fun of it in that way. But pastiche just emulates. In this way, it's very industrial, insofar as in factories you're reproducing things. And in pastiche, you're just reproducing some sort of formal, systematized way of writing. And in this way, I think there might be a little bit of a commentary on the vapidity of contemporary culture, of its ability to just reproduce from the same mold. And by copying this style, he's not even necessarily making a value judgment. He's just showing that, look, I can put anything in this style. I can go to any length. And for example, in episode 2 of part 1, one of our main characters, Pirate Prentice, has an interesting little hallucinatory episode where it's like we're in a monster movie like Godzilla or something, and our monster is a giant adenoid, which is, it's similar to your tonsils. It's in the same area as your tonsils. It's kind of nasally, and that's part of the quality of this adenoid, is it speaks nasally, which is a slight to the British style of speaking. And Prentice has to sort of act as the interpreter who goes out to the monster and is like, we come in peace, we're here to negotiate, or whatever. So he becomes this master negotiator in this sort of hallucinatory episode. And if you read it, you'll notice that we go from real life to pastiche to hallucination without much signaling that we're in there. We just sort of slide between things. It's almost like when Deleuze and Guattari say you don't so much have a face as slide into one. The face that the content takes on, that being the form, we kind of slide into it. And this is again in homage to that stream of consciousness style where you don't really have an outside voice telling you what to think about what's going on. You just experience things going on. And this sort of hints to the paranoiac feeling of being in the midst of all of this and your mind is going to all these places, and you have things like PTSD that are becoming significant, and it'll become even more significant in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, for example, when it becomes more popularized, especially. At this time, mental health was not anywhere as popular as it is today. But there's this sort of lingering, like, maybe this is a mental health issue that's sort of being blanketed over all of society. And if you want a good kind of literary equivalent of Pynchon's style in general, see the Circe episode of Ulysses. This episode has the same feeling of going in between appearance and reality, hallucination and bare plot in the same, like, vigorous sense. So if you can read the Circe episode, you can probably read this, because it takes you being really careful, first of all, not to place a value judgment on reality as more important than fiction, fantasy, hallucination, etc. Every manic episode has within it something that he's trying to bring out, and to give a commentary on real life without necessarily placing it below the real life it's supposed to tell us something about. Now, I mentioned the V-1 rocket earlier. This was the first iteration of these guided missiles, and the V-1 was more like drones that you see today. It was guided with a sort of propulsion system, but, you know, it flew sideways like a plane instead of up like a rocket. The V-2 would just shoot up, it would reach an apex, and then it would come down somewhere. and it would be guided by, this technology. Whereas the V1, it would have a railway that it would shoot off of, and then it would go on its merry way. And describing the V1, Pynchon writes, "Nothing that Luftwaffe dropped came near him. But this last summer they started in with those buzz bombs. You'd be walking on the street, in bed, just dozing off. Suddenly here comes this farting sound over the rooftops. If it just keeps on rising to a peak and passing over, why, that's fine. Then it's someone else's worry. But if the engine cuts off, look out, Jackson. It's begun its dive, sloshing the fuel aft, away from the engine burner, and you've got 10 seconds to get under something." Well, it wasn't really too bad. After a while you adjusted, found yourself making small bets, a shilling or two, with Tantivy Mucker Maffick at the next desk, about where the next doodle would hit. But then last September the rockets came. Them fucking rockets. You couldn't adjust to the bastards. No way. For the first time, he was surprised to find out that he was really scared. So right, we've gone from V1 rocket to V2. And the V1 had this very specific style. But with the V2, that change in the relationship to the auditory stimulus of knowing if it's coming or not, it changed the way people, there was this new sense of anxiety, of the sound of death, once again, being a good thing, in fact. And it's significant that they start making bets on these rockets. This is a quintessential aspect of World War II, is people have to cope with this via humor, with dark humor, with making bets on things, with, making little tiny jokes to help people get used to the feeling of impending death. And this comedy is going to saturate the novel. It makes it really enjoyable to read because, constantly it's hitting you with reality, but hitting you in such a way that it's the essence of comedy, something unexpected which hits you, and the only way you know how to react to it is to laugh. And regarding the V2, Pynchon writes, "It's nothing he can see or lay hands on. Sudden gases, of violence upon the air and no trace afterward. A word, spoken with no warning into your ear and then silence forever. Beyond its invisibility, beyond hammerfall and doom-crack, here is its real horror, mocking, promising him death with German and precise confidence, laughing down all of Tantivy's quiet decencies. No, bullet with fins, ace, not the word, the one word that rips apart the day." And the little thing about fins is a reference to a comment by a friend who said, think of it as a very large bullet, Slothrop, with fins. Right, that's that sort of humorous aspect. But here we've got an interesting little instance in which Pynchon has put in a little theological nugget with the idea of the Word with a capital W. Right, this is supposed to symbolize Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this links to the sort of, right, Jesus is supposed to be a figure of salvation, of the imminent utopian future to come, which I spoke of these grand narratives. But instead, the Word rips apart the day. So the Word, our supposed Redeemer and salvation, becomes the height of our self-destruction, the merging of the high and the low. And we get the first hint of this propitious moment in which the link of phallic imagery occurs between Slothrop's erections and the destructive power of the V2 rocket. The moment was 6:43:16 British double summertime. The sky beaten like death's drum, still humming, and Slothrop's cock. Say, what? Yes, look at inside. His GI undershorts. Here's a sneaky hard-on stirring, ready to jump. Well, great God, where'd that come from? There is in his history, and likely, God help him, in his dossier, a peculiar sensitivity to what is revealed in the sky. but a hard-on? Right? So it's almost like, is he getting a hard-on from the rocket or not? And that's kind of the mysterious nature of this novel, is we're not really sure to what extent is this some sort of pleasureful response? Is this some sort of heralding of some future moment, which again is seemingly, belated. It's already happened. And it's significant that the next paragraph is regarding a tombstone, which is imaged as a sort of phallic object, but of course is the epitome of the link between sex and death, right? Of this thing that stands erect, this tombstone, but which symbolizes death, which has already taken place, which is basically how the V2 is working. It's as if your death has already taken place by the fact that you don't know it's coming. This paragraph is interesting because it has the Joycean sense of developing an idea along with the tempo of a passage. You'll get this in the Nausicaa episode from Ulysses, where Leopold Bloom jerks off, and there's this image of a Roman candle which shoots up, and as it rises higher and higher and higher, you clearly, by the way that Joyce writes, you can tell this is Bloom's erection getting higher and higher. And that link between the rocket and the erection we can see directly in Ulysses, and now here. So the paranoia sort of blends into an ecstasy that meets with death. But what lights were these? What ghosts in command? And suppose in the next moment all of it, the complete night, were to go out of control and curtains part to show us a winter no one has guessed at. 643:16 BDST. In the sky right now, here is the same unfolding, just about to break through, his face deepening with its light, everything about to rush away and he to lose himself, just as his countryside has ever proclaimed. Slender church steeples poised up and down all these autumn hillsides, white rockets about to fire, only seconds of countdown away, rose windows taking in Sunday light, elevating and washing the faces above the pulpits, defining grace, swearing, this is how it does happen. Yes, the great bright hand reaching out of the cloud. Ellipses. And the ellipses is really significant because this just peppers every page. Ellipses, ellipses, ellipses. It's as if something more must be said. Something more always can be said, and yet it is unutterable. It sort of glazes over everything. And it's almost like you have to feel it by the empty spaces. That's also a Joycean idea of much significance. Oftentimes Joyce will be in the middle of these ideas in which someone is in some sort of like paranoid, like, oh my gosh, something's about to happen. And constantly the sentences are getting cut off by periods. And you're like, I need to know the idea. But that cutting off is significant. It's almost like the mind itself cutting itself off from something it can't face, which is a very Freudian idea. So right here, the tempo, the penis, and the anticipation all rise together. So right, you've got this erectile sense of anticipation, which you also see with the imminent destruction of the V2 rocket. And to back up this idea of the reversal of causality, of the fact of history seems to already be working against us in a nightmare we just have to live through, we read, a market needed no longer be run by the invisible hand, but now could create itself, its own logic, momentum, style from inside. Putting the control inside was ratifying what de facto had happened, that you had dispensed with God, but you had taken on a greater and more harmful illusion, the illusion of control, that A could do B, but that was false, completely. No one can do. Things only happen. A and B are unreal, are names for parts that ought to be inseparable. So right, these historical contingencies seem to need to have happened, and there's very little one can do about it. And yet, it's inconsequential in the cosmic scale. It doesn't hint to some future belated history that is utopian. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But it's not dystopian either. It's just in the middle. It's just real. It's bleak. And this invisible hand with a capital I and a capital H, we get all over these capital letters, which hints at the paranoiac feeling of there is some grand secrecy going on behind the scenes that I'm trying to figure out, but I'm always kind of on the back end, always on the losing side. I can never really figure out what's going on below the sheets. There's a security problem here. Loose talk sinks ships, and you can't be sure, even about Mexico. There are too many circles to the current operation, inner and outer. Distribution lists growing narrower as we move ring by ring towards the bull's eye. Instructions to destroy, gradually encompassing every scrap, idle memo, typewriter, ribbon. And we get mentionings of Operation Blackwing and intra-allied surveillance schemes, everyone watching over his shoulder, right? It is the classic conspiratorial mindset of someone who's into like QAnon, for example. Or, all these other strange, often right-wing, but not exclusively, beliefs that are conspiratorial in nature of, there's all the Jews are in power, they're harvesting adrenochrome from babies, and Joe Biden is a lizard person. You can see it in his eyes. Look at this video I can show you. There's constantly this feeling of, in the face of powerlessness, we go to fantasies. And these fantasies can be even sexual in nature, as a typical fantasy. But it can also be the fantasy of our death. That in order to cope with our death, it becomes predominant in our mindset, and we use things like humor to cope with it. So hopefully this has given you some headway in understanding some of the themes, some of the literary devices, some of the concerns of Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. Very interesting novel that I'm just kind of making my way through and hopefully giving you some ideas of importance. Check out any of my other lectures on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a monthly private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. Maybe you want to talk about some philosophy problem, maybe you need help with some reading, whatever it may be. You can also use Super Thanks to donate to the channel if you'd like, because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.